Hello, how are you? We're with the robins today. There's just one of them right here, but we'll see. We'll tell a story about You Can Fly. When the robin children, Robbie, Susie, and Herbert, were first hatched, they could not fly. Baby birds are not strong enough and they don't have the proper feathers yet. So they stayed in their nest home high in the pine tree, and Mr. and Mrs. Robin would bring them worms. So they would be able to eat worms. Poof, poof, poof. Worms, worms. To feed Robbie, Susie, and Herbert, and each day they grew stronger and bigger, and finally they began to lose their baby fuzz and get big feathers. Susie and Robbie couldn't wait until the day they could fly. Every time Mr. and Mrs. Robin came home with worms, Susie and Robbie begged, "Can't we fly today, please?" But Herbert looked down from the high limb where they lived, and he was afraid. The ground looked so far away, and although he knew that he was a bird, and birds can fly, he didn't believe he could fly. One day, Mrs. Robin said, "Today, you may try to fly if you want to." Robbie and Susie flapped their wings and shouted to each other and wobbled off the limb. They were sort of shaky, but they flew, and after some practice, they were just fine. That day, they flew all around Critterville, and they got their own worms. Herbert stayed in the nest home. He just didn't believe that he could fly, and he was afraid to try. After several days, his mom and dad said, "Herbert, you can't stay at home all your life and be fed. You have to fly, so we are not going to bring you any more worms. You will have to fly and get your own." With that, they just left. Very quickly. Herbert was alone in the nest. He kept thinking how far away the ground was and how afraid he was, and pretty soon he began to be hungry. And there were no worms, and Mom and Dad were not going to bring any. He looked over the big fat worm in the flower bed below. He was so hungry. He decided that even if he couldn't fly, he would just jump on the worm and he'd worry about how to get back home later. He jumped out of the nest, and he was falling so fast that he stuck out his wings to break his fall, and all of a sudden, he felt himself flying. He flapped his wings, and away he went. He forgot all about the worm. He was so delighted he was able to fly. And Mr. and Mrs. Robin were so delighted too. They had been watching from the oak tree right opposite. There are lots of things that we can do, but we don't do because we don't believe we can. You're not birds, but God has given you special abilities, and you must try to use them. Practice running and playing, and also thinking and reading and putting together things and loving others. These are some of your special gifts. So keep on doing them, eh? Because we can fly. Amen.